Okay, good evening. How's everybody doing? Wonderful. So you actually came back. I'm so pleasantly surprised after the insanity of Palm Sunday. So thank you for coming back, and it's even wonderful to have you as one of our altar servers and school kids joining us as well. So that's an awesome thing as well. And those who are joining us through the miracle of the internet as well. So apparently there are lots of people out there who are totally bored on a Thursday night and going to watch in their pajamas all about Holy Week. So we love this. So good. Well, let us begin as we begin all good things by placing ourselves in the presence of the Lord. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Our Lady, Queen of Peace, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, so we're ready for Holy Thursday. Good. Before we get to Holy Thursday, though, we still have other stuff about Holy Week going on. When you came in, we had handouts with a couple of things on them. A hymn for the liturgy of the Chrism Mass, as well as the antiphons that are sung during the washing of the feet on Holy Thursday. Those are just things for you to take home with you and to pray over as part of your kind of preparation for Holy Week. Now, the first 3 days of Holy Week are known in the English-speaking world as Fig Monday, Temple Tuesday, and Spy Wednesday. Have you ever heard of those? Okay, Spy Wednesday. I had not even heard of these until a couple of years ago myself. I'd never heard of that. Those are the titles in the English-speaking world. Fig Monday commemorates the fact that the day after his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, our Lord preached under a barren fig tree. Temple Tuesday commemorates the cleansing of the temple, which we had that reading in Year B in the ordinary form last Sunday. And Spy Wednesday, the betrayal of Judas. Now, they're kind of odd names because they're related not to the readings at Mass, but to what happened in that week. As Spy Wednesday comes to a close, we embark on the Paschal Triduum, the 3 days that are the heart of Holy Week. Now, the first of these days is Holy Thursday, although in the Anglosphere it is called Maundy Thursday, from the first word of the Latin antiphon, that Latin chant, which is prescribed for the washing of the feet done on this day. Mandatum novum do vobis. Mandatum novum do vobis, ut diligatis indicem. A new commandment I give you, love one another as I have loved you. Now remember that between the dawn of the Middle Ages and 1955, the services of the Paschal Triduum took place in the morning. Remember how I said, some people talked about, they joked about the Mass of the Lord's Supper being the Mass of the Lord's breakfast, right? It was all done in the morning. Now, because of the length of the morning ceremonies, then that meant that Matins and Lauds, the first 2 hours of the Divine Office. Okay, and when I say the Divine Office, do we know what we're talking about? Okay, those prayers that the church uses to sanctify the day. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Those 2 hours were anticipated the night before. After 1955, the office was moved to the morning and the Eucharistic liturgies to the evening. Okay, so it's important when we talk about Holy Week that the time thing is important to understand the history. Now, when we talk about the Divine Office, or the Liturgy of the Hours, we talk about how the church sanctifies time during the day with hymns, psalms, and spiritual canticles. The first 2 hours of the traditional 8-part office were called Matins and Lauds. And in antiquity, it was common for Christians to gather on the evening before the Lord's Day to pray through the night with these hours, and then celebrate Mass at dawn. Gradually, though, the office became the preserve of monks and religious who chanted it, and priests who read it. And the laity attended only very rarely on the eve of great feasts like Christmas or Pentecost. For some reason, however, Matins and lauds each day during the Paschal Triduum were often still attended. Now, because they took place in darkness, they were often called tenebrae, or the Latin word for darkness. And you can see this is tenebrae here at Prince of Peace. And I'll explain what's happening in the picture there. The heart of the service are 15 psalms, after each of which a candle is extinguished until the entire church is plunged into darkness. Another part is the chanting of the Lamentations, the book of Lamentations, which is attributed to the prophet Jeremiah. And also, have you ever heard that sound before? Okay. If you've been to Tenebrae, you have. It's called the strepitus. The strepitus is this loud, clanging noise, which is meant to evoke the closing of the stone over the tomb. Now, for the service, a 15-branched candlestick is erected in the sanctuary. You can see it there in our picture, so that the church grows increasingly dark as each is extinguished. Now, although it is called a tenebrae hearse in English, Mediterranean countries came up with all sorts of fanciful names for it, such as the Barabbas, for the man who was released instead of Jesus. And between these psalms and the chanting of the Lamentations are these responsories, which weave together biblical texts and have been set to some of the most incredible music in the history of the world. Now, what is most striking about Tenebrae is that it continues the most ancient forms of the divine office without a whole bunch of accretions that came about in the Middle Ages. Now, what's interesting about Tenebrae is that the texts serve as a powerful complement to the Eucharistic liturgies of the day, providing ample subjects of meditation on different aspects of the Passion. So Tenebrae for Holy Thursday focuses on the betrayal of Judas. Holy Saturday on the laying in the tomb and the harrowing of hell. So those are things that the Eucharistic liturgies don't have as much as themes, but are still integral to understanding that day. And so Tenebrae kind of fleshes out all of those things. Go forward one. There we go. Okay, so we can see this is Father Bradley, our English priest friend, who's singing the Lamentations. Then up in the right-hand corner, you can see the Barabbas there, the Tenebrae hearse. And then in the bottom is the Church of the Oratory in London, which is one of the most beautiful places in the world to go to Mass. They really do a beautiful job of Roman-style liturgy. And you can see that they have the Tenebrae hearse there and the two cantors who are singing the responsories. Now, because the services were originally anticipated the night before, they were often better attended than the Eucharistic liturgies, and in many places were followed by processions that lasted through the night. One of the most fantastic places that I ever happened to be for Holy Week was Seville in the south of Spain. And these processions go on all night long and all during the day for the entire week of Holy Week. And they even have like radio stations, like you're listening to the football game, and La Macarena is coming out of her temple and going down the Via whatever. It's really, really amazing to listen to all of this kind of commentary on the radio of the processions that go on constantly all the time. Now, in many places, it was impossible to observe all three Tenebrae. So Spy Wednesday became the usual time for people to experience Tenebrae. Now, remember how we talked about the great time change of 1955, right, when all the services were flipped from the morning to the evening? Well, after that, a lot of working people couldn't make morning Tenebrae and it gradually disappeared. In 1970, when the new Liturgy of the Hours was introduced, where the English translation is from 1973, there was a drastic reduction of the structure of it, and it basically killed it as we know it. So today, it survives only as a devotional service in some communities. Here at Prince of Peace on Spy Wednesday, we read Tenebrae, basically, and then try to sing the Lamentations, but that's about it. Partially because our choir is over here practicing for the rest of the Triduum, and I don't want all of the people who are involved in the music to hate me by the time they get to Holy Thursday, so they can actually get through all the services. So, but if you happen to have some singers on the side that you can bring for Tenebrae, then maybe we can sing all three of them at some point in the future. Now, to get a sense of these incredible responsories and lamentations, then I want us to listen to a few excerpts. Now, how many of you have ever read the book of Lamentations in the Old Testament? So, okay, good. This is a beautiful way to experience Holy Week. Now, of course, it's kind of sad, right? Because we're talking about, the destruction of Jerusalem and how the Jews are reacting kind of emotionally and spiritually to all of that. But the Lamentations are often arranged around the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So you have the letter of the alphabet in Hebrew and then, text. And the Roman chants proposed for them are said by some liturgical scholars to be melodically related to the same tones used in the temple for the same text. Now, some scholars say that. Some scholars say that this is totally bogus and invented and isn't really true. But if it is true, that's a pretty cool thing to think about. That when we go to Tenebrae and listen to the Lamentations, then that's the same kind of music that Jesus himself was listening to. Now, some of the most incredible chant melodies for them, however, came from the Mozarabic rite. Okay, remember how we talked about there's different families of rites in the church, all the Eastern rites, and then you have the Roman rite. Well, in Spain, you have what is called the Mozarabic rite. And some of the music for the Mozarabic rite is really incredible. And so in a second, we're going to listen to the first chapter of the Lamentations sung at Holy Thursday Tenebrae in one of the Mozarabic tones. But in order to give you a sense of what the difference sounds like, then I want to sing for you the Roman tone, which is still pretty cool. So the Roman tone, and then we'll listen to the Mozarabic tone. Okay? And I apologize for my singing, but this is what I got. Okay. Incipit lamentatio, Ieremiae prophete, Allah. Okay, first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, our letter A. Quomodo sedat sora civitas plena populo, facta es quasi vidua domina gentium, princeps provinciarum facta est sub tributo. And then we go into the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And it keeps on going until the end of each one, which is Jerusalem, Jerusalem, come back to the Lord your God. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, convertere ad Dominum Deum tuum. If you don't want to come back to Jesus after that, then you have a heart of stone. Okay. Now, the Mozarabs, super fun stuff. So let's listen to the Mozarabic lamentation. The same thing that we heard, but we're going to listen to the whole thing. It's like super fun. It's all Latin, so except for the Hebrew letters of the alphabet. One of the most beautiful experiences I've ever had in my life was at Tenebrae in Rome to sing that Mozarabic lesson in front of the Guido reigning masterpiece of the Trinity in the Church of Santissima Trinità. It was one of those things that just sent chills up my spine, being able to sing that beautiful tone. And every time Holy Week comes around, when I think of the lamentations and the sadness of Holy Week, that's what kind of rings in my ear. It's just an incredible thing. Now, the responsories that we talked about, between the lessons and the psalms, are also set to some very incredible chant melodies. But composers were like, wow, these texts and these melodies are absolutely amazing. So we're going to listen to two responsories. One is a Renaissance version from Victoria. This is the text, O vos omnes, O ye who pass by, from his Tenebrae of 1572. And then we're going to pass into François Couperin's first Leçon de Ténèbres from 1714. So again, these are the things that when people would go to Tenebrae in major churches with choirs and orchestras, these are the kind of things that often that they would hear. So, O vos omnes of Victoria, O you who pass by, see if anyone has a suffering like unto mine.
Thank you.
And then let's go to the coupé Maundy there. For a little bit of Baroque temporary acting. Taste of what it was like, Baroque French tenebrae as well. So, but in all of this, you can see where they are trying to evoke the response in different ways of looking at the suffering of our Lord through the lens of the Old Testament destruction of the temple. It really is kind of incredible music. Now, okay, so we're done with tenebrae for now. Moving on. When we talk about Holy Thursday, it appears that in antiquity there were actually 3 different masses on Holy Thursday. In the year 399, St. Jerome, who is the proof that cantankerous old men can get into heaven. Right? You know anything about St. Jerome? He was the Platonic form of curmudgeon. St. Jerome, in a letter, mentions a mass offered in which those who had been undergoing penance for their sins, especially during Lent, were readmitted to Holy Communion on this day. The first accounts we have of it, of how it was done, appear in what is called the Old Galasian Sacramentary, which was used by priests in the Diocese of Rome. And it appears to have been taken from the papal liturgy, from which it had already disappeared in the 7th century. Okay? In the Middle Ages, the rite of reconciliation of the penitents, you can kind of see that going on in the etching here, became very elaborate to such an extent that the Mass offered for it dropped out. Because they were like, oh gosh, and now we have to do Mass on top of all of this. So they just kept on elaborating the rite and then just kind of, had done with the Mass. Now, as private auricular confession, when you go in the box with a priest, grew in popularity, and the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 mandated it once a year. Okay, remember that all Catholics are bound to go to confession once a year if they've committed a mortal sin. The rite of reconciliation disappeared, although it was still printed in what is called the Roman Pontifical, which is basically the book that includes the text of ceremonies performed by bishops. It was kept in there until Vatican II. So centuries after no one was doing it, it was still printed. Now, the rite of reconciliation reached the zenith of ceremonial development in the 12th century pontificals. Okay, remember, pontifical is a liturgical book that's used by bishops alone, right? So simple priest, we don't do stuff that's in that book. Okay. In them, those who had committed sins gathered outside of the church doors, where a Mass was celebrated. After each sinner went to private confession, the bishop would decide who was worthy to reconcile and who wasn't. Can you imagine? Okay, so Bishop Robert, do you think I'm worthy? No, forget it. Maybe you'll wait till next year. Okay. And then assigned a penance. The bishop an archdeacon, a deacon, and 4 subdeacons would prostrate before the altar as the penitents prostrated before the church doors, barefoot with unlit candles. So you can see all these people flat on their faces with their shoes on with their little candle up, right? The clergy and the people sang the 7 penitential psalms and the litany of the saints. The bishop would then sing the antiphon, Venite, 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 fidi audite me, timorem Domini docebum vos. Come, 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 children, hear me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. So, that's a very kind of inviting thing, right? The bishop was like, come, children, and we'll learn the fear of the Lord together. It wasn't a, you horrible sinner, you stay outside of church. No, it was an invitation, right? The bishop, holding a lit candle, took the first penitent by the hand, and all of the other penitents joined hands in a chain and were led into the church, where they were absolved, sprinkled with holy water, and incensed, and granted indulgence. Now, to give you a sense of the church's purpose in praying this Mass, which has disappeared from our common worship, I want to read to you from the exhortation of the deacon at that liturgy. The appropriate time has come, the day of divine propitiation and human salvation, when death was destroyed and eternal life begun, when in the vineyard of the Lord such a planting of new shoots is made as will purify the corruption of the old. For although there is no time during which the riches of God's goodness and faithfulness are lacking, there is, at this time, thanks to his mercy, a wider forgiveness of sin and fuller reconciliation of the reborn. That's a beautiful text, isn't it? It's a great thing. Now, the second of the 3 Eucharistic liturgies generally happens in a cathedral with the bishop celebrating. In theory, it should happen on Holy Thursday, but in many places it's moved to another day in Holy Week, or even the preceding Passion Week, so that as many of the priests of the diocese can attend as possible. In the Diocese of Charleston, we have it on Tuesday of Holy Week. Now, a blessing for the oils used in the sacraments is already attested in the apostolic tradition, a document sometimes attributed to Hippolytus and originating in the 3rd century. A 5th century life of St. Sylvester places this blessing on Holy Thursday. Now, the Galatian Sacramentary, remember we talked about that text, has a Mass for the oils called the Chrism Mass and the Mass of the Lord's Supper. So we see that there are 2 different Masses. Now, a little bit later, we have not the Galatian, but the Gregorian Sacramentary, which instructs the bishop to bless the oils whenever he celebrated the Mass of the Lord's Supper. So the custom of the Gregorian Sacramentary, of the oils being blessed when the bishop celebrates the Mass of the Lord's Supper, dates from the 10th century. And that governed its celebration until 1956, when Pope Pius XII restored the blessing as part of a separate Chrism Mass. Okay? So we see that Pius XII kind of revived the Chrism Mass. Okay? Now, Pope Paul VI added to the Chrism Mass the renewal of the priestly promises undertaken at ordination. Remember that in the 60s and 70s, priests were abandoning their vocation by the thousands. And so Paul VI said, okay, maybe priests need to remind themselves every year of the promises that they made. So he inserted it into the Chrism Mass. Although when he did this, liturgists questioned the sense of this at a Mass designed to bless the oils, which are part of the sacraments other than orders. Right? The Chrism Mass is not really about the priesthood. It's about the oils, right, which are used in baptism, used in anointing, used in confirmation. But this whole kind of thing of the Chrism Mass as a celebration of the priesthood kind of started with Pius XII and then moved particularly with this action of Paul VI. Now, the blessing of the oil of the sick, because remember we have 3 oils, right? And I think if we go forward, okay, we have pictures of Chrism Masses. On the left, we have Mass of the Cathedral of Charleston, where I was ordained a priest, so it's like home for me always. And then we have at the top the 3 oils. the oil of the sick, the oil of catechumens, those are the people who are preparing for baptism, and the chrism. And then at the bottom, we actually see the 1955 rite of the Chrism Mass, celebrated by a bishop of the Society of St. Pius X, but that was in the picture that I could find in that particular row. So there we go. Now, the blessing of the oil of the sick takes place before the end of the Eucharistic prayer, and that of the chrism and the oil of catechumens after communion, because it's considered more fitting for the Eucharist to be consecrated before anything else is blessed. Now, it's permitted to do them all after the Liturgy of the Word, in the place where the Reformed liturgy does all of the sacraments that take place within Mass. The chrism, as the most noble of the oils, remember that's the one that has the fun balsam that's in there. So, like, when you baptize a baby, you get to slather his head with the chrism. All the mamas are like, ooh, that smells so good, right? That's the balsam that's put in the oil. Is consecrated, not merely blessed, as are the other two oils. The presentation of the oils to the bishop to bless was accompanied by rich ceremonial in the Franco-Roman tradition. Remember how we talked about the Gallican rite on Palm Sunday, right? The Gallicans, did all these very sumptuous and fun ceremonies, as opposed to Rome, which was pretty simple, get her done, boring, kind of approach to the liturgy. There was a solemn procession with a cortege of servers, deacons, and subdeacons, and in some places, priests who ceremonially concelebrated. Incense, candles, canopies, you name it, it was all part of the presentation of the oils. Now, the papal liturgy and the Roman liturgy today has simplified all of this. But the hymn appointed is still sung to this day. The hymn, Audi Judex Mortuorum, hear, O Judge of the Dead, is interspersed with the refrain, O Redemptor sume Carmen, and it remains the classical musical piece of the Chrism liturgy. So your handout has the English translation of that, because most Catholics don't get a chance to go to the Chrism Mass, right? It's in the morning on a Tuesday of Holy Week, so who can get to that? But it really is a beautiful text for meditation, so that's why we provided it. So in our video that we have, we see the procession of the oils from 2011 with Pope Benedict XVI at St. Peter's in Rome. So we get to see kind of how that procession is done now. It's a pretty cool thing, isn't it? So, yeah, to see that. Now, Holy Thursday's obvious reference point is the Last Supper, to such an extent that the official name of the day is Feria Quinta in Cena Domini, the fifth day of the week in the Supper of the Lord. From this point on, we're into Paschal Triduum. The sacraments are not celebrated except for confession, anointing, and viaticum, that's from last communion, in danger of death. The altar cross, let's see, maybe we go, let's go forward for a sec. Yeah, there we go, okay. The altar cross and the altar are vested in white, removing the penitential purple of Passiontide. Holy water is removed from the church, and the organ does not play except at the Gloria. The bells of the church ring forth at the Gloria and are silenced until its return at the Paschal Vigil. And in some countries, people used to tell their children, when the children were like, "Mommy, why don't I hear the church bells?" And they would say, "Well, the angels have taken them to clean to get ready for Easter," which is kind of a cute thing, isn't it? So, if it's not true, it should be. So, the bells are replaced by the crotulus, or the crepitaculum, which is better known in English as the clapper. And it's always a fun thing to see people who are used to the bells of the consecration all of a sudden on Holy Thursday, like this. It's like, whoa, what is that? So, this is the sound of what you did to Jesus. So we have the clapper. The Mass itself of Holy Thursday unfolds like any other Mass, with a few notable exceptions. The Church's hymn of praise, the Gloria, I think we can go back one. Okay, so you see that? Okay, the Gloria was introduced into the Roman liturgy under Pope Symmachus, who reigned from 498 to 514, on Sundays and Martyrs' Feast when a bishop celebrated. It was not until 1474 that it was prescribed in all Holy Thursday liturgies. The ringing of the bells actually started after the Mass of the Reconciliation of the Penitents, but by the end of the Middle Ages, it was transferred to the Gloria of the Mass of the Lord's Supper. Right? And you can imagine, after all these penitents were reconciled, everyone's all happy, let's ring some bells, this is great. But then the Mass dropped out, and then the Reconciliation of the Penitents dropped out, but people still wanted their bells, so it ended up at the Gloria of Holy Thursday. The clapper that replaces the bells was known at the monastery of Monte Cassino. Obviously, those of you who are fans of St. Benedict know that that's the kind of cradle of Western monasticism, in the 6th century, and spread from monasteries to cathedrals and parishes. Now, the Creed was not introduced to the Roman liturgy until 1014, and on Holy Thursday in 1120 in Rome, and then it was removed in 1969. The Kiss of Peace was omitted in remembrance of Judas's betrayal by a kiss. So the church was like, oh, no, not that day. Right? Until it was restored in 1969. In 1955, Pope Pius XII adopted a non-Roman custom. Remember when we say the Lamb of God, Agnus Dei, miserere nobis, and then we end on nobis facem. Well, in 1955, Pius XII changed it so that the third invocation was also miserere nobis, so 3 times have mercy on us. And then in 1969, it went back to the way it was before. So, likewise, the end of Mass was ite missa est, right? Go, you were sent forth, until 1955. Then it was replaced with Benedicamus Domino, let us bless the Lord, in view of the procession afterwards. And then in 1969, there's nothing. So, ite missa est to Benedicamus Domino to nothing. Okay, so there we go. Now, the Pope celebrates this Mass at what is called his Station Church. And this is very important for understanding the Lenten liturgy of Rome. And station comes from the Latin statio. If you go into our church, we have, thanks to Mr. McIntyre, this beautiful map of all of the stational churches of Rome. So there's a map of Rome with all the stations and the day where the Pope is going to be there during Lent. Because the papal court would stop to celebrate Mass at different churches on different days. And the stational church of the day is St. John Lateran, the Pope's cathedral church. Now, one of the most iconic parts of the Maundy Thursday liturgy is the washing of the feet. The antiphon accompanying which, as we saw before, gives its name. The ceremony is often called the mandatum. Remember, mandatum novum do vobis is what's sung during that. St. Augustine mentions it as early as the 4th century. In Rome, it appears to be a private thing the Pope would do in his apartments for his court. And formalized rites for it do not appear until 950 in Romano-German pontificals. Now, there seems to be a wide variety of copycat versions of the rite as well. A solemn liturgical foot washing in church, where clerics are involved, with the highest ranking superior being the one doing the washing, as well as these paraliturgical services that included kings and queens, monks, poor men, nuns, and poor women. And those happen elsewhere. Now, the Roman Pontifical of the 12th century instructs the Pope to wash the feet of 12 subdeacons in the Basilica of San Lorenzo fuori le Mura. Then, in a separate ceremony, the feet of 12 poor men. And each person whose feet were washed would receive a monetary gift from the Pope. The Franciscan Missal of 1243 attaches the hymn Ubi Caritas to the rite of foot washing. You know, where charity and love prevail, there God is ever found. Ubi Caritas et amor Deus ibi est. That's one of those beautiful pieces of chant, isn't it? From there, it became almost universal until in 1969, the chant was moved to the offertory of Holy Thursday, Mass of the Lord's Supper. By 1474, the mandatum after the end of the Holy Thursday liturgy had become reserved to the clergy. But even as late as 1600, the Ceremoniale Episcoporum, here's another book, which is the ritual handbook for bishops. So the text that they use is called the pontifical. How you do this is called the ceremonial. Okay. Instructs bishop to wash the feet of 13 poor men and give them money at a separate ceremony. This dual ceremony was reserved to bishops until 1955. This number is going to be like emblazoned on your memory after this class. When Pius XII made it a regular feature of the liturgy and inserted it after the gospel, instructing the priest to wash the feet of men in remembrance of Christ washing the apostles' feet. Not even the rubrics of 1969 changed this, and they used the Latin term vir to make it clear that only men were to have their feet washed, with the clear inference that the reference point of the ceremony was the priesthood of the apostles, not charity among believers. Now, Pope Francis, has disregarded this rubric for years. And so instead of changing the rubric, in 2016, he issued a decree that women could have their feet washed as well. Now, here's the problem with this. We have a little bit of confusion of symbolism here. The disappearance of extra liturgical foot washings of the poor of either sex, and then the kind of clericalizing of the rite by Pius XII, and doing it in the context of the Mass of the Lord's Supper, which is the institution of the priesthood as well as the institution of the Mass, narrows the symbolism to be one of a symbolic dialogue between Christ and the apostles about the burden of charity that the ministerial priesthood has for the priesthood of the faithful, of the baptized. So the symbolism of the Middle Ages is kind of both of these things in tension in two different foot washings. But now all of a sudden it's kind of telescoped in a way. So opening up the washing to women changes the symbolism to one of universal charity. Now, this is obviously the symbolism that is inherent in those second foot washings. But the inclusion of it in the Mass, at the point where Pius XII put it, provides an ambiguity of symbolism of the baptismal priesthood versus that of the ministerial priesthood. Okay? Does that make sense? So there's a confusion of the symbolism that is happening here. So it appears to me, this is my personal opinion, so you can take it or leave it, that the best way to respect, rather than undermine and confuse the traditional symbolism, is to direct bishops to carry out the mandatum for their priest at the Chrism Mass, and for priests to carry it out for anyone outside of the Mass, but still on Holy Thursday. Okay. But to this date, I'm not aware that anyone has made this proposal, and it's over my pay grade. So, it's not up to me to, make these decisions. Because I think that is the way to really kind of, the tension in that symbol to be able to respect kind of both parts of it. Either way, the antiphon prescribed for the foot washing is a lovely piece of music, so let's listen to it. So, thank you to Aaron for being so good to us. And even with the psalm tone, you have the sense of monks kind of walking forward. It's just great. It's wonderful. So, now, it's not until the 11th century that we find mention of a procession to remove the Blessed Sacrament from the altar on which Mass is celebrated to a duly decorated side altar. Okay. How many of you have been to the Holy Thursday liturgy and know that we have that procession at the end of Mass? Right? So, good. In the Ceremoniale Episcoporum of 1516, bishops are directed to make sure that the Pange Lingua was sung to accompany the procession. Pange Lingua gloriosi, corporis mysterium. Now, this hymn was written by St. Thomas Aquinas for Vespers, or evening prayer, of Corpus Christi, or the Feast of the Body of Christ. In 1600, it was set down that the last two verses of the hymn, the Tantum Ergo, should not be sung until the sacrament reached the place of reservation. Now, the ceremonial that accompanies the procession of the Blessed Sacrament to the place of reservation for Holy Thursday was borrowed from that of Corpus Christi. Incense, candles, we have an umbrella, which is called an ombrellino, and a canopy, a baldacchino, to cover the sacrament. The only thing that's different in the Corpus Christi procession is that the bells are replaced by the clapper. That's right. Okay. Let's go forward just one. I'm just missing. Okay. So we have a picture. Okay, let's go back. So I forgot to put a picture. That's my fault. Random gears there. Okay, we'll go back. There we go. Okay, so sorry. The place of reservation has been called many different things and has had many different shapes over the years. Before 1955, it was most often referred to as a sepulchre, with a clear evocation of the idea that we were journeying with the body of the Lord to bury it in the tomb as a result of the death on Good Friday. The place of reservation looked like an urn, and gives the sense of the fundamental unity of the mystery of Holy Thursday with the mystery of Good Friday. The institution of the Eucharist and the priesthood on the one hand, and the sacrifice of Calvary on the other. Remember, for Catholics, those two are very important. Let's go back one more just for a second. I just want to say something. Okay, those are just beautiful pictures. Let's go back one more. Okay. Oh, that's the picture of the Mandatum. Okay, I forgot about that. So you see the Mass at Santa Trinità in Rome, Pope Francis washing the feet of someone in Rome, and then the oratory in London washing the feet of that. So those are both the ordinary form. Okay.
Here or here that you're thinking of?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay, here we are. Okay, so thank you, because otherwise I don't remember what I had there. So see, on the bottom, we have the ombrellino, the umbrella. That's here at Prince of Peace. And then on the top is when we have the baldacchino. So now, of course, you've got the Brompton Oratory where the aisles are 15 feet wide, whereas the Prince of Peace, especially in the transepts, and everyone's going like this, so we couldn't use the balcony if we wanted to. So we used that outside, and then the Oberlino on the inside. So awesome, great, thank you. But you can see that there is an Oberlino that Mr. Ross there, the Minister of Ceremonies of the Oratory, is carrying, because from the altar to the sanctuary gates, the Oberlino would accompany the Blessed Sacrament, and then in the grand space of the church, the balcony would take over. So, awesome. Okay. Now, people would then watch before the sepulchre. Let's go back. One, maybe? One more? Nope. Okay, forward two. There we go. Okay. So people would watch before the sepulchre until the Eucharistic liturgy of Good Friday, when the Blessed Sacrament was brought back from the sepulchre. And the sepulchre was richly decorated with candles, flowers, carpets, altar cloths, and frontals, and the custom developed in Catholic countries of going around to visit various sepulchres in different churches. Now remember, of course, you have this in the morning of Holy Thursday, and until the morning of Good Friday, so you had plenty of time to go to all these churches. In the top picture, you can see a little bit of the sepulchre at Santissima Trinità in Rome, and then on the bottom is the repository at Prince of Peace last year. Now, of course, the Adoration Chapel was entirely different this year, so we'll have to update the photo for the next thing. Now, but what was carried in the procession? Until 1955, 2 altar breads were consecrated at the Mass. The first was consumed by the priest at the Mass of the Lord's Supper, at which Holy Communion was distributed to the faithful. The second was placed in a chalice, as opposed to a ciborium, which is the usual vessel for carrying the Blessed Sacrament. And then that chalice was covered with a white silk veil and tied with a purple ribbon. As we will see next week when we talk about Good Friday, this second host was consumed by the priest, and Holy Communion was not distributed to the faithful. Now, in 1955, a ciborium containing host for communion of the faithful was brought in the procession. And instead of going to a sepulchre in the shape of an urn, the Blessed Sacrament is placed in a regular tabernacle called a repository. And the altar upon which this tabernacle is placed is called an altar of repose. So I'm sure that you've heard that title for what we have now. The watch, because remember before, it was from the end of the Mass of the Lord's Supper all the way through to the Good Friday liturgy. 1955, the watch ends at midnight, in view of the time when our Lord was taken away from the apostles in the Garden of Gethsemane on the night of the Passion. So he's taken away from us, so the end. Now, the thing is that with this change, the ritual and symbolic connection between Holy Thursday and Good Friday is severed in favor of a practical reservation of hosts for the communion of the faithful on Good Friday. They're like, okay, we're going to start giving communion on Good Friday now, so we've got to get it over there, so this is how we get it over there. Okay, that's kind of the idea. Whereas before, as we'll talk next week, there's a whole other kind of language of symbolism that's there. It is one of the first instances of a rationalist and pragmatic capitulation to calls of liturgical scholars to restore what was thought to be an ancient custom. And this was an exercise in antiquarianism of the same kind that Pius XII himself condemned in his encyclical Mediator Dei in 1947. He wrote an encyclical letter in 1947 talking about the liturgy. And he says, there's certain kind of modifications that we really need to consider, but don't go crazy and throw the baby out without the bathwater, right? That's kind of the idea. And he said, you can't just randomly restore things because they're old. But yet, this is exactly what happened with this, as we'll see. Now, either way, until 1969, since the Mass of the Lord's Supper was essentially an evening or vesperal liturgy, regardless of when it was actually celebrated, Vespers was chanted in the church at the main altar, and then the Mandatum took place after Vespers in cathedrals. Now, after the liturgical ceremonies of Holy Thursday are completed, there was a very simple, practical thing that needed to happen. The altars had to be stripped of their cloths and frontals to be laundered. And the altars needed to be cleaned, because the whole rest of the year they were covered with all this stuff, so you couldn't exactly get to them and clean them. And it was a way of preparing for the brightness and the newness of Easter. Also, since the Eucharist will not be celebrated until Easter, well, there wasn't really a need for altar cloths. Now, some historians posit that the altar linens were routinely removed from altars outside of the Mass, so this was just kind of the last survival of that practice. The antiphon diviserunt sibi vestimenta mea, they have divided my garments among them, and Psalm 21 were sung during the stripping of the altars at Rome from the year 1230. The clergy changed their vestments from festive white to penitential purple. You can see that in our picture of them stripping the altars in London with the purple stoles on. The current missal directs the stripping of the altars with no music, text, or ceremony attached at all. Here at Prince of Peace, we still do the stripping of the altars with the diviserunt sibi, partially because we want the people to engage in that, and otherwise, I think most people would be like, why aren't they just like, randomly like just throwing stuff away? It doesn't seem like there's an actual action going on. So we sing the diviserunt sibi during the stripping of the altars. After the stripping of the altars, the last ceremony to take place on Maundy Thursday was the purification of the altars. St. Isidore of Seville in 620 mentions washing the walls, pavements, and vessels on this day. 200 years later, Rabanus Maurus quotes Isidore and adds the washing of altars. John of Avranches, around 1060 to 70, is the first to mention washing with water and wine. In the first half of the 15th century, an ordinal of the Gilbertine order in England gives one of the few extant descriptions of this. And I think this is really kind of, it's a liturgical handbook, so the language of this is kind of, do this and then do that. But the way that it's written, I think, is kind of beautiful. The prior, he's kind of the second in command in the monastery, vested in surplice and stole and barefoot, is directed to wash both the altars and the crucifixes on them with boughs of hyssop or yew as a symbol of the flagellation. First pouring wine over each of the 5 crosses inscribed in the altar, and in each of the 5 wounds in the figure of the crucifix, and then scattering water over and around the altars and crucifix, representing the blood of redemption and the water of regeneration which flowed from the side of Christ. That's just intensely beautiful, isn't it? By the year 1290, when Durandus, who is one of those people that we'll hear from a couple of other times, wrote his Razionale explaining the allegorical symbolism of the liturgy, the ceremony was already disappearing. And in fact, it was never kind of universal. The Roman books never mention it. It's like it never happened. Goddard's book on Holy Week, which is one of the things that I mentioned that you might want to read, claims that it went out of use everywhere except at St. Peter's in Rome, where it continued until the mid-20th century. Now, remember, when the reforms of Pius XII occurred, and the services were transferred from morning to night, they actually became a private ceremony done by the canons of the Basilica when the church was closed. And it was still happening when I left the seminary in 2005. It just wasn't, done, publicly. It was just kind of a private thing, and they did it and got it done, and that's fine. Now, some Anglo-Catholics who are, members of Anglicanism who, kind of are attached to certain kind of Catholic liturgical traditions, revived the custom in their parishes, and our present custom at Prince of Peace of washing the altars with vinegar and water with a sponge in silence is taken from the custom of a place called Nashotah House in Wisconsin, which was an Anglo-Catholic seminary. Some of you remember that we had a pastoral associate in the parish who had studied there before becoming a Catholic, and he introduced it into our liturgy in 2015. So it was a nice way to kind of take that ancient Roman liturgy and kind of rework it for today through that. So we've continued to do that. Now, the Mass of the Lord's Supper commemorates and renews within the Church the Last Supper, the first act of the divine drama of his Passion. It announces in advance the bloody immolation of the morrow, already wrought virtually in the institution and first offering of this sacramental sacrifice, which would henceforth perpetuate the memory and redeeming power of Calvary. The cross casts its shadow on Holy Thursday. It modulates not with sorrow, but with gravity, the Church's thanksgiving for the Lord's gift of the sacrament of his real presence. For on this day, joy rules. This day is called, I'll get the next page, the Natale Calicis, the birthday of the chalice, the anniversary of the institution of the Holy Eucharist, and therefore of all of our liturgy. The picture that you see is from Braga in Portugal, where there's the Church of the Bom Jesus, the Good Jesus, and there's this beautiful staircase that goes down to it, that when you come down all the stairs, you can see the form of the chalice, which is there in the center. It's been one of the coolest things that I've ever seen going up to the church. So, okay, so there we are. Thank you for your attention. Okay, so questions that you may have about Holy Thursday from what we've said so far. I might give a quiz if you don't, because this will be the shortest class I have. Gary. Braga in the northern part. It's super cool. Yeah, it's a really, really amazing place. Other questions? You guys are quiet tonight. I can't believe it. Last week we were here for hours. So. Holy Thursday is probably the one that's the closest to just kind of normal Mass. So, with just a few things kind of added. So.
Did you say you're going to be doing the 15 candle service?
Yes, the Tenebrae with the 15 candles we do on the Wednesday of Holy Week. So I think we have it scheduled for 6 p.m. Yeah, because part of it is also depends when Easter is because we want to be able to time it so that the church is dark for the end of Tenebrae, and sometimes we haven't always gotten our timing right on that. So we're able to observe that as well, and it's a beautiful story. Even though we read most of it, just the whole kind of gradual darkening of the church and the meditation on those texts is a really, really stunning thing. So come and join us for Tenebrae.
Father?
Yeah.
Can you explain again the difference between the chrism oil and the other blessed oils? What was the difference with the chrism oil?
Okay, so of the 3 oils, we have the oil of the sick and the oil of catechumens, which are basically just olive oil. Then the oil of chrism is kind of associated with the dignity of the priesthood. So whether it be the priesthood of the faithful, right, in the sense of baptism, or the ministerial priesthood. And so because of that, it has this admixture of of balsam into it to make it smell more. So the 2 of them, the oil of the sick and the oil of catechumens, are blessed, whereas the chrism is consecrated. And so basically, the idea of consecration is a much more intensified blessing. I mean, it's a longer blessing. The idea that it is nobler, and so therefore the blessing is not only longer, but it also has more kind of elements to it for the consecration. So, it's like the difference between, you bless your child before she goes to bed, right? I mean, that's a nice little blessing. That's set you apart for Jesus, which is different than like the consecration of a nun to God, right? So, which is a different level, which is still a blessing, but a very intense blessing. I guess is probably the easiest way to kind of explain it. So.
Thank you.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The oil of catechumens is part of the anointing before baptism, and then chrism is the anointing after baptism. And the oil of the catechumens, there are some scholars who think that during the rites of the catechumenate before baptism, that oil may have been applied at various points. Now it's kind of right before, on the chest, on the heart, in the ordinary form, and then the chrism is on the head.
Father, are these oils kept in that silver box to the right on the altar?
Yes, in our church, if you're looking at the altar, there's a silver box, which is actually a tabernacle. We use it as an altar, which is the technical term for the place of reservation for the oils. so our big silver oil things are in there. So yeah. So that way, and if we actually have the key in it. But anyway, so yeah, so just don't tell them that. So yeah, so if you're going to look at the oil, then you're welcome to do that. Don't do that with the tabernacle. So the oil is in there. Yeah. Okay, so at the cathedral, there is the Chrism Mass that actually happens on Tuesday of Holy Week in our cathedral in Charleston. Because otherwise because the diocese is so big, the priest can't go on Holy Thursday morning and then try to get back for everything. And so most of the parishes won't have Mass on Tuesday of Holy Week because all the priests are gone. Father Tomlinson is staying back, so he'll actually celebrate Mass here. Then in the parishes, that we have one Mass. So at the cathedral, there'll be one Mass of the Lord's Supper, and in Prince of Peace, there'll be one Mass. But it's only one Mass. Like, you can't celebrate a whole bunch of Masses, like we would do on a Sunday, for example, or a holy day. Because, again, the idea is the entire Christian community comes to celebrate the Mass of the Lord's Supper at one time in each parish.
So the oil consecration or blessing of the 3 oils, is that only at the basilica?
That's only in the cathedral. Yeah. So at the cathedral is consecrated the oils for every church in the diocese.
Okay, so
that's on Tuesday of Holy Week. Yeah. It's prescribed for Thursday of Holy Week, but for practical reasons, it's moved in different places. Yeah. So, and what happens is, I mean, you have this grand ceremony with these huge receptacles. Well, then they've got to get it into everybody's little receptacle for all the churches in the diocese. So they bring it down to the crypt of the cathedral, and while the priests are at the luncheon afterwards, then you have these poor people at the cathedral, who are desperately trying to get all the oils in everybody's thing. And then, of course, the priest, being priests are always like, I've got to get back to my parish and need my oils now. And so the priests so that these poor people try to kind of prioritize it as much as they can for the people who have to go the longest distance. So it's kind of interesting. Right? So, yeah. Okay.
So on Thursday, practicality, okay?
Yeah.
One Mass. Now, the turning out of the lights, that's also on Thursday, isn't it?
Well, it's prescribed for Holy Thursday, but what was happening in many places, it was anticipated the night before. So that's why we do it on Wednesday. So, yeah. So, and partially it was because there was just so much to do. Many priests would just anticipate the night before the morning offices of the next day. But when Pius XII kind of changed the times of everything and Tenebrae landed in the morning, a lot of people, it's a work day for most people, Holy Thursday, and even Good Friday, so they just couldn't go to it and it just kind of disappeared in those places. So, you have any questions? Yes. If you go to the narthex of the church, where the central doors are to the right, where usually we have the picture of Bishop Maundy. Don't tell him I take his picture down during that. So we put the picture of the station churches of Rome there. So yeah, and it's a little bit high up, so you can't see it very well. But you can see enough of it to kind of get a sense of where all the churches are in Rome. And it's a great thing because before the 14th century, when the Pope went to Avignon, the Pope would go to a different church of Rome every day with the people of Rome to celebrate Mass. And so certain days were associated with certain churches. And even to this day, the Pope still celebrates the Mass on some of those stational days. So, yeah.
Is there ever any oil left over from the year? What do you do with that?
Yeah, sometimes there's oil that's left over. It should be burnt or put down a sacrarium, which is that there's a special sink in the sacristy that goes directly into the ground instead of into the sewage system. So things that if you have a host that somebody's upchucked or something like that, then obviously Father's not going to consume that. So he puts it in the special sink, and then it all just kind of disintegrates into the ground. So that the sacrarium where it should be burned in the oil. You're not supposed to, yeah. So, but sometimes, People play fast and loose with that because oil can become rancid. So you don't want somebody's oil from 30 years ago that's smelling funky in your offering because that's just not a good thing for anybody. So, okay, good. So next week is Good Friday. We have a lot to cover on Good Friday, and just so you can be prepared for the Holy Saturday class is super long. So if you need to bring some victuals to share or a bottle of wine or whatever, do it on the Holy Saturday one because you'll need it because we're going to be here for a while. Just like the vigil. Have a good night. Thank you.